Wind claws at the surface of a western sea, dark as iron under a winter sky. 4 white shapes ride the waves, their wings heavy, their necks bowed with an age no bird should bear. They are swans, but their voices are human. From the shore of Oidheadh Chloinne Lir, a small island off Ireland's Atlantic coast, a bell rings out across the water, thin and bright in the storm. According to the early modern Irish tale Oidheadh Chloinne Lir, the fate of the Children of Lir, this is the sound the 4 swan children have waited 900 years to hear. Bound by a stepmother's curse, they have circled lakes and sea strands through frost and thunder, singing songs that make warriors weep. Now, at the first clear peal of a Christian bell, the spell that has defined their existence begins to crack. Their feathers tremble. The sea pulls at them like memory. And in that moment, as the waves break white around their bodies, the story asks us a question. What does it mean for an old world to end and a new one to begin? You're listening to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, and this is Swans of Sorrow episode. I'm your host, and today we're traveling to medieval Ireland, into one of its most haunting tales of transformation, exile, and belief. The Children of Lir is a legend from the Irish mythological cycle, the body of stories about the supernatural race called the Tuatha Dé Danann. In its best-known written form, it comes from a Christianized late medieval world, but it looks back to an imagined age of gods and enchanted lakes. Over the next half hour, we'll trace this legend from its earliest surviving manuscripts, through its many retellings and regional variants, and into its modern afterlives in sculpture, literature, and national memory. Along the way, we'll ask a central question. What does this story reveal about the people who told it and the Ireland they were living in? So far, we've heard the sound of that distant bell. Now let's step back and ask, where did the story come from in the first place? Now, as we begin, imagine a scribe in a Gaelic monastery or learned household sometime in the late Middle Ages. He bends over a vellum page, copying in early modern Irish prose the tale he calls Oidheadh Chloinne Lir, Fate of the Children of Lir. In the manuscript tradition, Oidheadh Chloinne Lir belongs to what Irish scholars call the mythological cycle, but the language of the tale is later than the oldest mythological material. Modern editors at the Celt Project at University College Cork describe it as an early modern Irish prose story, with the title already listed in a 1526 catalogue of the Earl of Kildare's library, showing that a version of the tale circulated in book form by the early 16th century. The text we can read today survives in a cluster of manuscripts from the 17th to 19th centuries, including 2 volumes in the National Library of Scotland, a copy in the British Library's Egerton 164, and others in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin. Scholars like Robin Flower and later commentators have noted that the Children of Lir is grouped with 2 other tragic narratives, Oidheadh Chloinne Uisnai and Oidheadh Chloinne Tuirean, as the Trí Truagha na Scéal Aochta, the 3 sorrows of storytelling, and have suggested that all 3 may go back to a common author or at least a closely connected circle of learned poets in northwest Connaught, perhaps in the 14th century. It is important to underline what we actually know here. We have a tale in early modern Irish, written down in late medieval or early modern manuscripts, with a title documented in a 16th century library catalogue. The story almost certainly draws on pre-existing oral narratives and on older mythological names, Lir, Bobderg, the Tuatha Dé Danann, but the exact shape of the Swan children's story, as we know it, is a product of a Christian, manuscript-keeping culture. You may have seen popular articles online claiming that the Children of Lir is first recorded in the Libor Gabala Eren, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, an 11th century compilation of pseudo-history. Libor Gabala does mention Lir as a figure among the Tuatha Dé Danann, but standard catalogs and electronic text projects do not list a Swan Children episode there. Instead, they treat Oidheadh Chloinne Lir as a separate, later prose narrative, with no surviving 11th century copy. So, a common misconception is that our exact version of the Swan story is as old as the earliest Irish chronicles, when the material we can actually document comes from significantly later. Where did the idea of enchanted swan children come from? Here we move from firm ground into more debated territory. Some folklorists have noticed that the Children of Lir resembles tales grouped under Arne Thompson Uther type 451, The Maiden Who Seeks Her Brothers, which includes stories like the German Six Swans, where six brothers are turned into birds by a hostile stepmother and can only be freed by their silent sister after long suffering. Joseph Jacobs, in the late 19th century, suggested that the Swan Children was an independent folktale, later inserted into the mythological cycle of the Tuatha Dé Danann. More recently, the Irish folklore site maintained by Carlow County Library notes that the Children of Lir story is based on a legend which reached Ireland from Britain or from France at the end of the Middle Ages, pointing to the wider European family of swan children narratives and the Night of the Swan romances. Other scholars, like Daoife O'Hogain in his reference work Lore of Ireland, as summarized in later commentary, have argued more specifically for a Dutch or Northern French origin for the underlying folktale. At the same time, textual critics such as Cowaymin Breitnach, writing in the journal Ariu in an article tellingly titled The Religious Significance of Oidheadh Chloinne Lir, focus less on where the motif came from and more on how the Irish version has been shaped into a Christian story of suffering and redemption. So far, we have a late medieval Irish prose tale, drawing on pan-European motifs, written into a Christian worldview, yet anchored in the mythic time of the Tuatha Dé Danann. But the story only truly comes alive when we follow the children themselves. And for that, we have to watch as jealousy takes hold in a royal house of the Sidhe. Now, as the legend is told in the edited text of Oidheadh Chloinne Lir, as translated by Eugene O'Curry and revised by Richard J. O'Duffy in the 19th century, the story begins at the end of a supernatural age. The Tuatha Dé Danann, those shining people of the hills, have been defeated at the Battle of Tailtiu and have withdrawn into their siege, the Hollow Hills of Ireland. They elect a new king, Bob Derg of Munster, a decision that angers another powerful lord, Lir of Sid Fionnghuala. To heal the rift, Bode B offers Lir one of his foster daughters in marriage. Lir chooses Aoife, described in modern retellings by writers like Lady Gregory and P.W. Joyce as gentle and beautiful. And she bears him 4 children, the daughter Fionnghuala and the sons Aoife, Fiachra, and Conn. These 4, in both the medieval prose and later folk versions, are the joy of their father's house, running across the green mounds and asleep in a tangle around Lir's bed. But happiness doesn't last. According to both the O'Curry-O'Duffy text and popular summaries such as the one on the mythical Ireland site, Aoidh dies after giving birth to the twins, and Lir is plunged into grief. Bob Derg, anxious to keep the alliance, sends a second daughter, Aoife, to marry Lir in her sister's place, a detail that echoes medieval marriage customs in which a widower might marry his late wife's sister to preserve kinship bonds. At first, Aoife cares for the children. But, in a pattern recognized by students of European fairy tales, her affection warps into jealousy when she sees how entirely Lir's heart belongs to his 4 swan-bright heirs. In the Irish prose text, she feigns illness for a year, her mind hardening around a single resolve. The children must be removed if she is to have Lir's love. One day, Aoife orders her chariot and invites the children to travel with her to visit their grandfather, Bodb Derg. The scribes tell us they ride to Loch Derbreach, identified in modern geography with Loch Deravarag in County Westmeath, a long, crooked lake whose shores still carry place names tied to the legend. When they arrive, Aoife asks the children to bathe. As soon as they are in the water, she lifts a druidic wand and pronounces a spell. In O'Curry's translation, she declares that they will become swans, their human bodies gone, their new forms condemned to wander for triple centuries. Fionnghuala, the eldest, reproaches her, insisting that the power of their friends and of Bodb Derg will outlast Aoife's malice, and she forces Aoife to set limits to the curse. Aoife decrees that the children will spend 300 years on Loch Derbreach, 300 on Sruth na Mhaile, the narrow storm-lashed strait between Ireland and Scotland, and 300 on the western waters around Eoras Domnan and Innis Gluair. Crucially, Aoife allows them to keep their human minds and their voices. The Irish text stresses that they will sing music sweeter and more sorrowful than any heard in Ireland, a gift that will draw people of both the Tuatha Dé Danann and the mortal Milesians to the water's edge. In later oral and literary retellings, from Ella Young's Celtic Wonder Tales to countless school anthologies, this becomes one of the defining images of the story. 4 white swans on a dark lake, singing human songs that can still a storm or break a heart. When Aoife returns without the children, her lie, that Lir would not let them travel, quickly unravels. Messengers ride to Lir's side, and he, fearing the worst, hastens to the shore of Loch Breach. There he hears voices he knows better than his own, and finds 4 swans gliding on the water, calling to him by name. The scene, as edited on the Celt site, is devastating. The children explain what has happened, Lir and his people spend the night listening to their music, and then he returns to Bobderg with the news. Bob summons Aoife, forces her to confess, and when she admits that a demon of the air is the worst form she can imagine, he strikes her with a druid's wand and condemns her to wander the world in that shape, a punishment that medieval audiences would have recognized as worse than death, a permanent exile from both human and otherworldly communities. From that moment, the center of the story shifts. The human court of Lir recedes, and the narrative follows the swans. Their first 300 years in Loch Breach draw visitors from all over Ireland, but time moves relentlessly forward, and eventually, even the Tuatha Dé Danann grow distant. When the appointed span ends, the wind rises and the swans must turn their wings northwards, towards the bitter channel between Ireland and Aodh. Now, as the legend travels with the swan children, the tone darkens. The second station of their exile is Sruth na Maila, usually understood as the North Channel or the Straits of Moyle, between Antrim and the Mull of Kintyre, a notoriously rough stretch of water. According to the point-by-point summary based on O'Duffy's edition, the 3 centuries they spend there are the harshest of all. Storms rise from every quarter. Waves tower over them, frost locks their feathers, and at one point, in a detail preserved both in the Irish text and in later summaries, their feet freeze to the ice sheet that covers the sea. In O'Curry's translation, they cry out to the King of Heaven, professing belief in a true God, perfect, truly intelligent, and from then on, they are spared the worst of the weather, a moment that overtly imports Christian language into what otherwise looks like a pagan mythic setting. Folklore collections from Carlow and other counties condense the timescale, sometimes speaking of 400 years on the lake, 300 on the Moyle, and then a shorter span, 3 years rather than 300 on the western coast. But the emotional pattern remains the same. The children are battered by natural forces and by isolation, separated in storms and reunited over and over. In some modern retellings, they meet surviving members of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who tell them of the passing of their father Lir and of Bobderg, turning the swans into living fossils of a lost era. After the centuries on the Moyle, the swans' third station is Eorus Domnan, usually correlated with Eris in County Mayo, and finally Innisglúair, a small island off that coast. Here, their exile takes on a quieter, more contemplative tone. On the island, they are surrounded by other birds, and in some local lore, Innisglúair becomes a burial place, not only for the swan children, but also for saints and chieftains, layering Christian Grave Island traditions onto a pre-Christian landscape. A striking Carlow County Library version, based on 20th century oral tradition, has the swans return at one point to their old home at Sid Fionnghuala in what it identifies as County Armagh, only to find the Sid abandoned and overgrown. The shock of seeing their former life erased underscores how radically Ireland has changed during their long years as birds. In modern terms, the story is describing what we might call deep time, compressing centuries of cultural and religious transformation into a single family's lifespan. So far, we've followed the Children of Lir as enchanted exiles in a fading pagan world. But in every major version of the story, their final transformation is triggered not by a druid's wand, but by the arrival of Christianity. And that is where the tale's late medieval theology comes to the In the Oidheadh edition and the Celt electronic text, the last third of Oidheadh Chloinne Lir takes place almost entirely on Aoife Gluair. There, the swans live out the remainder of their 900 years until an event foretold by Aoife's curse comes to pass. Lairnia MacColmain, a king in Connaught, marries Aodh, a princess from Munster. At the same time, Christianity arrives in Ireland. A holy man named Mochomhog, portrayed as a follower or spiritual descendant of St. Patrick, comes to Aoife Gluair. He rings his handbell to summon people to the night office of matins. The medieval text explicitly links the end of the enchantment with the preaching of the faith. The swans, hearing this unfamiliar sound, are at first terrified, but Fionnghuala tells her brothers that this is the bell foretold to them, and that its ringing will free them from their suffering. The bell falls silent. The swans respond with song. Mochomhog, astonished, follows the music and discovers that its source is 4 white birds who can speak and sing in human language. When they tell him they are the Children of Lir, he explains that he has come to that very place for their sake, and he binds them gently together with silver chains, a striking image of spiritual community as a protective bond. But courtly politics intrude even on this remote island. News of the Wonder Swans reaches Queen Aoife, now married to Lairnian. In a scene reminiscent of both fairy tale queens and medieval miracle collections, she insists that her husband bring the swans to her, treating them as desirable curiosities rather than as suffering persons. Lairnian comes in person to the island, seizes the chains, and in that moment, the last condition of Aoife's spell is fulfilled. The swans' feathers fall away, and 4 emaciated, time-ravaged humans are left in their place, not children, but ancient men and a woman, their bodies bearing the full weight of 9 centuries. Fionnghuala then asks the saint to baptize them and to bury them together, with Fiachra on her right side, Conn on her left side, and I before her face, recreating in death the protective arrangement she had formed around her brothers during the worst storms of their exile. Mochomhog baptizes them in the Christian faith, after which they die peacefully and are buried in a single grave. The story ends not with vengeance on Aoife or the restoration of their youth, but with a Christian funeral. Coimhin Breitnock's detailed study in Eriu argues that these Christian elements, the bell, the saint, the baptism, the explicit references to the true God, are not simply tacked on but are central to the way the medieval redactors wanted the tale to be read, as a narrative of suffering that only finds meaning in the light of Christian salvation. That reading fits with the broader pattern of Irish literature from the later Middle Ages, where older mythological material is reframed as a kind of pre-Christian shadow of the Gospel era. If we pause here, the core arc of the Children of Lir is complete. But, as with any good legend, the story did not stay frozen in that single form. It migrated across regions and genres, picked up new details, and came to mean different things in different times. Now, as the legend traveled beyond the pages of monastic manuscripts, it began to split into multiple tellings. 19th and early 20th century collectors like P.W. Joyce, Douglas Hyde, Patrick Kennedy, and Lady Gregory published English translations and adaptations that simplified the prose, heightened the emotional moments, and sometimes changed details like the time spans or the names of the saint. In school readers and children's books, the holy man who baptizes the swans is sometimes identified directly as St. Patrick, and Aoife may be whisked away in a dark cloud rather than turned into a demon of the air, a shift that smooths out the more abstract medieval punishment into a vivid image. Regional folklore adds its own variations. The Carlow County Library version places the transformation firmly at Lake Daravara in County Westmeath, gives the swans 400 years on the lake, 300 on the Sea of Moyle, and just 3 in Eris, and has them return to a desolate Sid Fiona Chide in what it identifies as County Armagh, before finally meeting St. Mochomhog and dying as withered old people after baptism. An Irish-American library blog summarizing Ella Young's Celtic Wonder Tales expands upon the medieval text's mortal wanderer named Ibrick, through whose encounter the swans lament that Tierna Nog and Moimel are no more, before the bell rings and their souls are finally released to the other world, a more openly elegiac and poetic variant. Modern storytellers and novelists have also recast the story from new angles. Brian O'Sullivan's and Deirdre Sullivan's contemporary retellings, analyzed in a 2022 Breno University thesis, keep the skeleton of the myth but focus on character psychology and on voices, usually marginal in older texts, such as Aoife herself. These works highlight how the raw material of the legend invites reinterpretation. Is Aoife a flat villain, a tragic figure consumed by mental illness and jealousy, or something stranger, an embodiment of the destructive side of change? Scholars of narrative tradition point out that the Swan Children motif is far from unique to Ireland. The international tale type ATU 451, The Maiden Who Seeks Her Brothers, includes stories like the Brothers Grimm's Six Swans, where a sister must rescue her brothers from a bird-shaped curse, and French and German Knight of the Swan cycles blend swan siblings with Arthurian and crusading material. Folklorists working with Irish material, cited in the Children of Lir article and in the codex entry for Oidheadh Chloinne Lir, have long suspected that the Irish tale represents a localization of this broader European family rather than an entirely independent invention. This is where another common misunderstanding creeps in. Because the name Lir is shared with the mythological sea figure who is the father of Manannán mac Lir in other Irish sources, some popular discussions assume that the Swan Children are younger siblings of the sea god, or that the story must be native and oceanic in origin. In fact, as Daithi O'Hogan's entry on Lir is summarized in later commentary, there is no early evidence linking the sea god narrative complex directly with the swan tale. The Lir of Oidheadh Chloinne Lir is an inland Sid Lord, associated with Sid Fiona Chade and with inland lakes, not the open sea. The overlap in names seems to have encouraged later mythmakers and readers to fuse separate figures, a reminder that even names in myth are not always stable. So far, we have followed the legend as it shifts in time, place, and emphasis. But why did medieval Irish writers and later Irish communities keep returning to this story of four swan children, centuries of exile, and a bell on a far western island? To answer that, we need to talk about meaning. So, what does the Children of Lir legend reveal about the people who told it? One way to approach the question is to look at how scholars like Caimhín Breitnach read the tale's religious structure. In his article, The Religious Significance of Oidheadh Chloinne Lir, Breitnach surveys the narrative's Christian elements, the language about the King of Heaven, the role of the saint, the focus on baptism at the end, and argues that the story should be seen as a Christian meditation on suffering and salvation, not merely as an old pagan tale with a Christian epilogue glued on. In this reading, the children's long exile dramatizes the idea that earthly suffering, however prolonged, is ultimately redeemed through faith and sacrament. At the same time, literary historians place the Children of Lir within a late medieval culture fascinated by the transformation of Ireland from a land of gods and heroes into a Christian kingdom. By setting the events at the symbolic end of the Tuatha Dé Danann's rule, and by allowing the children to outlive their own mythological world, the tale turns them into witnesses of history. They see the old divine order fade, the Milesians ascend, and finally the gospel arrive on their western shore. Folklorists who compare the Children of Lir to ATU 451 tales also point out that these stories often explore family loyalty in the face of betrayal by a parent or step-parent. In the Irish case, this takes on a distinctive inflection. Lir himself never betrays his children, but he is powerless against Aoife's magic and against time. The children's loyalty is expressed not through a questing sister, as in continental versions, but through their refusal to abandon one another despite centuries of hardship. That, too, tells us something about the values being imagined: kin solidarity, endurance, and the belief that songs and stories can preserve identity when bodies and kingdoms fail. In modern Ireland, the legend has taken on additional layers of meaning. A large bronze sculpture of the Children of Lir by Oisin Kelly stands in Dublin's Garden of Remembrance, commissioned in 1964 and installed in 1971 to honor those who died in the long struggle for Irish independence. The statue is widely understood to symbolize the rebirth of the Irish nation, with the Swan Children's 900 years of enchanted exile echoing Ireland's centuries-long struggle for independence. Another monument in Ballycastle, County Antrim, looks out over the Sea of Moyle, physically tying the tale to the northeastern coastline. Local tourism materials use the story to connect visitors to both myth and landscape. The swans also glide through music and literature. 19th and 20th century composers wrote orchestral works, oratorios, and ballets based on the tale, including Hamilton Hardy's tone poem, The Children of Lir, and Patrick Cassidy's Irish-language oratorio of the same name. Songwriters and folk musicians have reimagined the story in lyrics and ballads, often focusing on Fionnghuala's voice as a symbol of grief and resilience. Jewelry designers and craftspeople, as described by cultural blogs and retailers, use the intertwined swans as motifs for pendants and rings, presenting them as symbols of enduring love and family bonds. Teachers and children's authors continue to retell the legend in classrooms and picture books, sometimes emphasizing the cruelty of the stepmother, sometimes the hope of eventual freedom, sometimes the quiet bravery of 4 children who refuse to let exile define them. In contemporary commentary, especially around the Dublin Monument and Irish Heritage Month events, the Children of Lir are often read as an allegory of Ireland itself, a small community cast into long hardship, crossing seas and centuries, yet retaining a sense of inner identity until the moment of political or spiritual rebirth. This allegorical reading is a modern overlay rather than something we can confidently attribute to medieval authors, but it shows how readily the story lends itself to questions of exile, colonialism, and return. So what have we learned? The Children of Lir is an Irish legend preserved in early modern Irish prose as Oidheadh Chloinne Lir, first clearly documented in 16th century library catalogues and later manuscripts, but drawing on older mythological names and on a wider European swan children motif. In its best known form, the tale tells how 4 royal children are transformed into swans by their jealous stepmother, Aoife, condemned to 900 years of wandering across Lake, Northern Channel, and Western Sea before a Christian bell and a holy man's baptism finally released them into frail humanity and peaceful death. Across manuscripts, folklore collections, and modern retellings, the details shift. Time spans change, saints are renamed, new characters appear, but the emotional arc remains the same. Love, betrayal, long exile, and a hard-won freedom that comes too late to restore what was lost. For medieval writers, as Brett Nash and others argue, the legend served as a Christian meditation on suffering and salvation. For later Ireland, it has become a flexible symbol of endurance, identity, and transformation in the face of historical upheaval. If this journey with the Children of Lir moved you, I invite you to follow the podcast in your app of choice, so you won't miss future dives into the stories, myths, and legends that shaped our world. Next time on Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, we are going to start a new season. It's based on our album, Path to Freedom, and contains 10 stories of people fighting against oppression. Until then, may your roads be kinder than those of Lir's children, and may the stories you carry help you find your way home.